The city was asleep, or at least it was pretending to be. Down on the street level, the usual hum of traffic had faded into a distant, rhythmic breathing. High above the avenues, inside a quiet corner of a sprawling urban landscape, a man sat alone. He wasn't waiting for anyone, and he wasn't hiding. He was just existing. To the rest of the world, he was a name on a movie poster, an action hero who defied gravity and death on the big screen. But up here, in the soft light of the late hour, he was simply a man who had learned how to carry the weight of silence. Keanu adjusted the sleeves of his sweater and looked out the window. The view was familiar, a tapestry of concrete and glass that he had spent decades staring at from different heights, in different cities. He liked the night. It was the only time the world seemed to stop asking things of him. During the day, there were cameras, microphones, and the expectations of millions. But at night, when the sky turned that deep shade of midnight blue, the noise quieted down and he could finally hear his own thoughts. He stood up and walked toward the closet. His movements were slow, practiced. He pulled on his boots, the leather worn in just the right places. He wasn't going out to party or to be seen. He was going out to move. That was how he coped with the stillness, by challenging it. He grabbed his helmet, the black surface reflecting the dim light of the room, and headed for the exit. He pushed through the glass entryway of the building and stepped out into the cool air. The street was empty, save for a few parked cars and the flickering lampposts standing guard like silent sentinels. Straddling his motorcycle, he felt a small shift in his chest. The engine roared to life, a sound that vibrated through his bones and chased away the quiet. He didn't have a destination in mind. He just needed to feel the wind against his face. He rode through the streets, the buildings blurring into streaks of shadow and light. This was his church. The hum of the machine beneath him was a prayer of sorts, a way to feel connected to the world without having to speak to anyone in it. People often thought they knew him. They saw the interviews where he smiled politely and gave thoughtful answers. They saw the memes and the stories of him giving up his seat on the subway. They called him the internet's boyfriend or the nicest guy in Hollywood. And he was kind, genuinely so. But kindness is often a quiet armor. It protects the things that are fragile. Nobody really saw the moments when the armor felt heavy. They didn't see the long stretches of solitude where the absence of particular laughter echoed louder than any city noise. He pulled over the side of the road near a park that was cloaked in darkness. He cut the engine and let the silence rush back in, but this time it felt different. It felt less like a burden and more like a blanket. He took off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair. The air smelled like pavement and damp earth, a scent that grounded him. He sat on a bench, watching the leaves rustle in the gentle breeze. In his pocket, his phone buzzed once. He ignored it. It wasn't that he didn't care about people. He cared too much. That was the problem. When you love deeply, the loss of it leaves a space that doesn't easily fill up. He had known great love in his life, and he had known terrible loss. Those experiences had carved out hollows in his heart, spaces where the wind whistled through. Over the years, he had learned to build a fire in those hollows to keep himself warm, but the fire needed tending. He thought about the concept of time. It was a strange thing. When you are young, you think you have forever to figure things out. You think love is something you chase, a butterfly you have to run after with a net. But as you get older, as the gray starts to pepper your beard and the lines around your eyes deepen, you realize love isn't something you chase. It's something you recognize. It's a frequency. And for a long time, he hadn't been tuned to that frequency. He had been surviving. He had been taking the hits and getting back up, just like the characters he played. But tonight, sitting on this cold bench with the city sleeping around him, he felt a subtle shift. He didn't feel lonely, not really. He felt ready, not ready to jump into something chaotic or loud, but ready to let the light in a little bit more. He realized that he had spent so much time protecting his heart that he had almost forgotten how to open the gate. The gate wasn't locked, though it never had been. He had just been standing on the other side, waiting for the right moment to step through. He remembered a conversation he had once had with a friend about grief and healing. His friend had told him that grief is just love with nowhere to go. He liked that. It meant that all the love he still held for the people he had lost wasn't gone. It was just waiting. It was dormant, like a seed in winter. The ground was hard and the frost was biting, but the seed was still alive. Keanu stood up and walked back to his bike. The street lights cast long shadows on the pavement. He felt a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. It wasn't a loud epiphany. There were no choirs of angels or sudden flashes of lightning. It was just a quiet acceptance. He was okay. He was more than okay. He was a man who had seen the darkest corners of life and had managed to not just survive them, but to keep his softness intact. That, he knew, was his greatest victory. He put his helmet back on and restarted the engine. The noise shattered the stillness again, but it didn't feel aggressive anymore. It felt like a heartbeat. He rode back toward his home, taking the long way around. He passed by late-night diners where people sat in red booths, laughing over coffee. He passed by a convenience store where a clerk was stocking shelves, nodding to the music on the radio. Life was happening everywhere, in small, beautiful ways. When he finally arrived back at his building, he parked the motorcycle and sat on it for a moment, just listening to the engine click as it cooled down. He looked up at the sky. The clouds had parted, revealing a few scattered stars. It was a small sight, but it made him smile. It reminded him that even in the middle of a massive city, nature was still there, doing its thing. He walked back inside, taking the elevator up to his floor. When he stepped into his apartment, he didn't turn on the main lights. He just let the city glow filter through the windows. It was enough. He poured a glass of water and stood in the living room, looking at the books lined up on the shelves, the art on the walls, the empty chair opposite the sofa. It was a good life, a peaceful life. For years, he had thought that healing meant forgetting. He thought it meant scrubbing the memories away until they didn't hurt anymore. But now he understood that healing meant carrying the memories differently. It meant letting them sit beside you instead of crushing you. He had carried his weight for so long that his back was strong. He could bear it. And maybe, just maybe, he was strong enough now to help carry someone else's weight, too. He took a sip of the water and felt the cool liquid slide down his throat. He thought about the future, a concept he used to fear, because it used to look so empty. But the future didn't look empty tonight. It looked like a blank page, waiting for a new story. Not a story about action or explosions. A story about quiet mornings, shared coffee, and the simple, profound act of being known. Keanu set the glass down on the counter and walked toward the window one last time. He placed his hand against the glass, feeling the cold vibration of the city outside. He was a part of this world, connected to it by invisible threads. He was no longer an island drifting in the dark. He was a harbor, waiting for a ship to come home. He didn't know when that would happen. He didn't know who would walk to the metaphorical gate of his life next. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't hoping for the storm to pass. He was learning how to dance in the calm. He turned away from the window and headed toward the bedroom. The silence of the apartment followed him, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. It felt like a promise. He closed his eyes, ready to sleep, ready to dream, and most importantly, ready to wake up. The healing wasn't finished, and perhaps it never truly is. But the man who lay down to rest that night was not the same man who had woken up that morning. He was lighter, he was open, and he was ready. The days that followed that quiet night of realization were not filled with sudden grand gestures or dramatic changes. Life continued at its usual pace, but the air felt different. It was as if a window had been cracked open in a stuffy room, letting in a fresh breeze that he hadn't realized he was starving for. It started with an invitation. It wasn't to a movie premiere or a flashy party. It was an invitation to an art gallery showing, a small gathering for people who created things rather than just sold them. He arrived fashionably late, a habit he had picked up over the years to avoid the initial rush of greetings and small talk. When he walked into the space, the smell of paint and canvas greeted him, mingling with the scent of white wine and soft cheese. The room was buzzing with low conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished floor. He moved through the crowd with familiar ease, nodding at a few familiar faces, keeping his hands in his pockets. He was comfortable in these settings, but he was rarely fully present. He was usually watching, observing from a distance. And then he saw her. She was standing near a large abstract painting, her head tilted slightly to the side as she studied the brushstrokes. She wasn't dressed to impress in the way Hollywood usually defined it. There were no glittering gowns or heavy jewelry. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her beautiful silver gray hair, was pulled back loosely. He had always admired that about her. In an industry obsessed with youth and hiding every sign of aging, she wore her silver hair like a crown. She didn't dye it, didn't hide it. She was entirely, unapologetically herself. He remembered working with her years ago. They had collaborated on a book. He had written the words, and she had drawn the pictures. Back then, he had appreciated her talent and her calm demeanor. She was easy to work with, smart and kind, but they had moved in different circles, and life had carried them along separate currents. Seeing her now, it felt like bumping into an old friend you didn't know you missed until they were standing right in front of you. He made his way across the room. As he got closer, she turned, as if sensing his approach. When her eyes met his, her face lit up. It wasn't a fan's gasp or a polite social smile. It was a smile of genuine recognition and warmth. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Hey," he replied. "It's been a while." They didn't go for the awkward hug or the formal handshake. They just stood there, smiling at each other, the noise of the gallery fading into the background. They started talking, and instantly the rhythm felt right. They didn't talk about the movie business or box office numbers. They talked about the art on the walls. They talked about a book she was reading. They talked about the weird feeling of being in a city that never sleeps but always feels lonely. Keanu found himself relaxing his shoulders. He hadn't even realized he was holding them up, tense against the world. Around her, it didn't feel like Keanu Reeves. He felt like the guy who rode motorcycles and liked to read philosophy. She looked at him when he spoke, really looked at him, as if his words mattered. She wasn't waiting for her turn to speak. She was listening. There was a moment, about halfway through conversation, where a waiter passed by with a tray of drinks. Keanu reached for one, but his hand brushed against hers. It was a small accident, a fleeting touch of skin against skin, but it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with static electricity. He looked at her, and for a second, the conversation stopped. He saw something in her eyes that mirrored what he was feeling, a sense of safety. He realized then that he'd been walking through the world with his guard up for so long. He had built walls to keep the pain out, but those walls also kept the joy out. Standing there with her, he felt the walls crumbling, not with a crash, but like sand slipping through an hourglass. She didn't need him to be strong. She didn't need him to be the tough guy. She just needed him to be there. "You look happy," she said to him at one point, taking a sip of her drink. It was a simple observation, but it hit him hard. "I am," he said, and he realized it was true. "I'm finding my way." She nodded. "It's a process, isn't it? The figuring it out." "The never-ending process," he agreed. They laughed. It was an easy sound, natural and unforced. He looked at the gray strands in her hair and the lines around her eyes that formed when she smiled. He saw the life she had lived, the battles she had fought, and the peace she had made with herself. She was real, in a room full of plastic people and fake conversations. She was the most solid thing he had touched in years. As the evening went on, the crowd began to thin out. People were leaving, heading to dinners or clubs. But Keanu didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay in this bubble of understanding they had created. He realized that he was lonely, but not in the way he used to be. He didn't just want a warm body next to him. He wanted this. He wanted someone who spoke his language without needing a dictionary. He wanted a partner in the truest sense of the word. She mentioned she was getting hungry and suggested they grab a bite to eat at a small place down the street. It wasn't a fancy date. It was just two people who didn't want a conversation to end. They walked out of the gallery together. The night air was cool, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the sidewalk. They walked side by side, not touching, but close enough that their energies mingled. They found a small diner that was open late. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of coffee and bacon grease hung heavy in the air. It was perfect. They slid into a booth in the corner. The waitress came over, looking a bit surprised to see him, but he just gave her a nod and ordered coffee. Over greasy fries and more coffee, they talked about everything and nothing. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, and their dreams. He told her about his motorcycle rides, and she told him about her latest art project. He listened to the way her hands moved when she talked, animated and passionate. He watched the way she crinkled her nose when she laughed. It was in that diner booth, with the background of the kitchen and the clatter of silverware, that he felt the shift. It wasn't a loud clanging bell. It was a soft click, like a key turning in a lock. He looked at her and realized that he didn't have to pretend to be anything other than a man who was trying his best. She saw him. She saw the scars, and she saw the strength. She didn't shy away from either. When they finally said goodbye outside the diner, the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The city was waking up. Taxis were starting to cruise the streets, looking for early risers. "I'm glad I ran into you," he said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Me too," she replied. She reached out and squeezed his arm. It was a firm, grounding touch. "Let's not wait so long next time." "I won't," he promised. He watched her walk away to catch a cab. He stood there on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the taillights fade into the morning traffic. He felt light. The heavy coat of solitude he had worn for so long felt a little looser, a little lighter. He got on his bike, but he didn't speed away. He rode home slowly, letting the cool morning air wash over him. When he walked back into his apartment, the silence was waiting for him, but it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was filled with the echo of her laughter and the memory of her eyes. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city come to life. He realized that healing wasn't something you did alone in a dark room. Sometimes, healing was just finding the person who was willing to sit in the light with you. He didn't know where this was going. He wasn't planning a wedding or writing a love song in his head. But for the first time in a long time, he was excited about the unknown. He thought about her silver hair and her honest smile. He thought about the way she listened. He realized that he had been looking for a feeling of safety, a place to rest his heavy heart. And maybe, just maybe, he had found a person who could help him carry it. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows. Keanu walked into his kitchen and started making breakfast. The routine was the same, but the man doing it was different. He was humming a tune he couldn't quite place, a melody of hope that he hadn't heard in years. He was ready to open the gate. He was ready to let the light in. And it all started with a simple conversation in a room full of art. Time moved differently after that night in the diner. It wasn't a sudden shift, but rather a slow, steady turn of the tide. The days began to fill with small, quiet moments that didn't need to be announced to the world. There were coffee runs in the morning, walks through the park when the sun was just beginning to set, and hours spent in comfortable silence while reading books in the same room. They were building something, but it wasn't a structure of brick and mortar. It was a shelter of trust, built piece by piece, conversation by conversation. As the weeks turned into months, the bubble they existed in felt less like a hiding place and more like a home. He found himself smiling at his phone when a text from her popped up. He found himself looking forward to the end of the day, not because he wanted to escape, but because he wanted to return to her presence. She had a way of disarming the chaos of his life. When he was with her, the noise of the industry, the rumors, the expectations, the pressure seemed to dissolve into the background. But there was a lingering hesitation in the back of his mind. He had spent decades protecting his private life, like a dragon guarding a gold hoard. He knew that the moment he stepped out with her, really stepped out with her, the lens of the world would turn its focus on her. And he didn't know if he was ready to subject her to that kind of scrutiny. He knew what the cameras could do. They could be kind, but they could also be cruel. They loved to build people up just to watch them fall. Then came the invitation. It was for a major art gala in the city. It was a kind of event where the fashion was scrutinized as much as the art, where every arrival was captured by 100 flashes at once. In the past, he would have gone alone, walked the line, nodded politely, and disappeared inside as quickly as possible. Or he would have taken a co-star as a friend. But this time, he looked at the invitation and knew that he didn't want to go alone. He wanted to share the evening with the person who made his life feel lighter. He asked her, not with a grand speech, but while they were eating takeout on his living room floor. He just slid the envelope across the table and asked if she would go with him. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a moment. She knew what he was asking. It wasn't just about a date. It was about stepping into the light together. She didn't flinch. She just smiled and said yes. The night of the gala arrived with a nervous energy that he hadn't felt in years. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked at himself, the gray in his beard, the lines on his face. And for once, he didn't try to imagine himself as a younger, smoother version of himself. He felt solid. He felt like a man standing on the edge of a new chapter. When she came out of the other room, his breath caught in his throat. She looked stunning, but it wasn't just a dress. It was the way she carried herself. She looked like a queen who didn't need a crown to prove her worth. Her silver hair shone under the lights, and her eyes held that familiar, warm spark. She walked over to him and straightened his tie, a simple, intimate gesture that grounded him instantly. "Ready?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, and he meant it. The car ride over was quiet, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the calm before the storm. When they pulled up to the venue, the noise hit them immediately. It was a wall of sound, shouting, music, the hum of engines. The red carpet stretched out like a river of fire. He stepped out first, the flashes exploding in a blinding strobe light. He paused for a moment, his hand going back into the car to help her out. As she emerged, the shouting seemed to get louder, but he tuned it out. He focused entirely on her. He offered his arm, and she took it, linking hers through his. This was the moment. This was a line in the sand. For years, he had walked this line alone, keeping his heart shielded. Tonight, he was walking it with his heart on his sleeve. They walked down the carpet, and he felt a strange sensation wash over him. Instead of feeling exposed, he felt proud. He wanted the world to see her. He wanted them to see the woman who made him laugh, who listened to him, who understood the weight he carried without asking him to put it down. He squeezed her arm gently, a silent communication. "I've got you and you've got me." They stopped for the photos. Usually, this was the part he dreaded, the awkward posing, the shouting of instructions from photographers. But tonight, he found himself genuinely smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile he used for premieres, but a real one. He looked at the cameras. Then he looked at her. The photographers went wild. They could see it. They could see the connection. It wasn't performance. It was a glimpse of something real. He saw her looking at the crowd, not with fear, but with a quiet dignity. She wasn't intimidated by the spectacle. She was just there, present and grounded. Seeing her strength gave him strength. He realized he had been worried about protecting her from the world, but she was showing him that she could stand right beside him in the fire. Once they made it inside the venue, the noise dampened and the air cooled. They walked into Main Hall, surrounded by art and beautiful people. But he only had eyes for her. They found their table. And as the night went on, he watched her talk to the people sitting next to them. She was brilliant and funny, drawing people in with her intellect and warmth. He sat back, sipping his drink, feeling a deep sense of contentment settle in his chest. He leaned over at one point and whispered in her ear, "You're the best thing here." She laughed, squeezing his hand under the table. "You're just saying that because you're biased." "Maybe," he smiled, "but I'm also right." Later in the evening, they got up to look at some of the exhibits. They stood in front of a massive abstract painting, colors swirling in chaotic motion. He stood behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "I was scared to do this," he admitted softly, speaking close to her ear so only she could hear. "Bringing you here, letting everyone see." "I know," she replied, leaning back into him slightly. "But you don't have to carry the weight alone anymore. That's the point of being a pair. You share the load." He closed his eyes for a second, letting her words sink in. For so long, he had equated strength with solitude. He thought being strong meant handling everything on his own, not burdening anyone else with his darkness. But she was teaching him that true strength was letting someone in. It was saying, "I can't do this all by myself," and finding that the person next to you says, "I know. That's why I'm here." When they left the gala, the energy outside had shifted. The frenzy had died down a bit, but the impact of their arrival was already spreading. He knew the headlines would be out by morning. He knew the internet would be dissecting their outfits, their smiles, their history. But for the first time, he didn't care about the narrative. They got back into the car, the heavy door sliding shut with a thud, cutting off the outside world. The silence that returned was welcoming. He let out a long breath he didn't know he was holding. "You okay?" she asked, turning to him. He looked at her, really looking at her, seeing the woman who had walked through the fire with him and hadn't burned. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "I'm better than okay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm free." He realized then that the courage to be seen wasn't about fame or ego. It was about honoring the connection they had. It was about refusing to hide something beautiful just because the world might be messy about it. He had spent so long in the shadows that he had forgotten how warm the sun felt. Tonight, he had stepped into the light, and instead of getting burned, he had found a way to shine. As the car moved through the city streets, taking them back toward the quiet safety of home, he watched the streetlights flash across her face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know what the headlines would say. But he knew that as long as she was next to him, he could handle it. The armor was off, the gate was open, and he was finally, truly home. The flash of cameras and the noise of the gala faded into the background, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of everyday life. For a man who had spent decades living out of suitcases and on movie sets, the transition to a life grounded in domesticity was strange but welcome. The mornings became his new favorite time of day. There were no call times, no heavy makeup chairs, and no scripts to memorize. There was just the soft light of the sun creeping through the blinds and the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. He would wake up often before she did, lying in the quiet darkness and listening to the sound of her breathing. It was a sound that anchored him. In the past, silence had been his enemy, a void where his darker thoughts would creep in. But now, silence was a canvas where peace was painted. He would slip out of bed carefully, trying not to disturb the warmth of the covers, and pad out to the kitchen in his socks. The routine was simple, but he cherished it. He would grind the beans, listening to the crunching sound, and wait for the water to boil. When she finally emerged, her hair messy and her eyes half closed, wrapping a robe around herself, he felt a sense of completeness that had nothing to do with box office numbers or critical acclaim. They would sit at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, sipping from mismatched mugs, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes saying nothing at all. It was in these moments that he realized love wasn't always a grand fireworks display. Most of the time, it was just boring, beautiful normalcy. Their life together was a blend of two creative worlds. Since they were both artists in their own right, the house was always filled with projects. There were stacks of books everywhere, sketch pads lying open on the couches, and half-finished ideas scattered on the dining table. One afternoon, they decided to collaborate on a new piece. It wasn't for a movie or a gallery show. It was just for them. He sat on the floor with a notebook, scribbling down thoughts that had been rattling around in his head. He read them aloud as he wrote, testing the rhythm of the words. She sat across from him, her charcoal pencil moving furiously across a large sheet of paper. She was sketching him, or maybe she was sketching the feeling of the room. He could never quite tell, but the connection was palpable. He would read a line about loss and time, and she would nod, her hand in the emotion on paper. "This is good," she said softly, not looking up from her drawing. "It feels honest." "It feels easier with you here," he admitted. "Usually I get stuck in my own head. I overthink everything." She stopped drawing and looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "You don't have to overthink with me. Just let it out. I'll catch it." And she did. She became the net that caught him when he fell. There were days, of course, when the weight of his past came back to visit. Grief has a way of doing that. It doesn't just disappear because you are happy. One particular afternoon, a gray mood settled over him. It wasn't triggered by anything specific. He just woke up feeling heavy, the memories of loss pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. He tried to hide it at first. He went about his day, answering emails and making phone calls, but he felt like he was moving underwater. Everything required too much effort. By the time evening rolled around, he had retreated to the living room, sitting on the sofa with his elbows on his knees, staring at a blank television screen. She found him there. She didn't ask him what was wrong, and she didn't try to cheer him up with forced optimism. She didn't tell him to look on the bright side. She understood that sadness wasn't a problem to be fixed. It was a weather pattern, and sometimes you just had to wait for the storm to pass. She walked over and sat down on the floor next to him. She leaned her back against the sofa, close enough that her arm brushed against his leg. She opened a book and began to read quietly to herself. Her presence was a gentle reminder that he wasn't alone in the dark. After a few minutes, he reached down and tangled his fingers in her hair. She leaned into his touch like a cat, seeking warmth. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't want to ruin the day." She closed her book and turned to look at him. "You didn't ruin anything. You're human. You're allowed to hurt. Just let me sit here with you." They sat like that for a long time. The room grew darker as the sun went down, but neither of them moved to turn on a lamp. He realized then that this was what true partnership looked like. It wasn't about two people being happy all the time. It was about having someone who wasn't afraid of your sadness. It was about having someone who could hold the space for you while you worked through your pain, without making it about themselves. He felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen. The heavy armor he had worn for so long, the stoic, tough guy exterior, felt unnecessary. He didn't have to be strong for her. He could be broken. He could be a mess. And she would still be there, sitting on the floor, holding his hand. As the weeks went by, they fell into a rhythm of work and rest. They spent weekends in the garden, tending to the plants and flowers. It was a metaphor for their own lives, pruning back the dead growth to make room for new blooms. He loved watching her hands in the soil. She was so gentle, nurturing life out of the dirt. It reminded him that beauty often grows from the hardest places. One evening, they decided to stay in and cook dinner together. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of roasted vegetables and garlic. He was chopping vegetables while she stirred a pot on the stove. Music played softly in the background, a low, bluesy record that skipped occasionally. He watched her move around the kitchen with effortless grace. She was humming along to the music, swaying her hips slightly. It was such a small, unguarded moment, but it made his heart ache with how much he loved her. He put down the knife and walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. She leaned back into him, resting her head on his chest. "What?" she asked, laughing softly. "Nothing," he said, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I just like this. I like us." "Me too," she said, covering his hand with hers. "It's nice, isn't it? To just be." "To just be," he repeated. The phrase resonated with him. For so long, he had been doing, acting, running, fighting, grieving. He hadn't just been in a very long time. They ate dinner at the small table, lit by a single candle. They talked about their dreams for the future, not the big, scary ones, but the small ones. They talked about maybe getting a dog, or taking a trip to a place where nobody knew their names. They talked about growing old together, a concept that used to terrify him, but now seemed like a privilege. After dinner, they washed the dishes together. He washed, she dried. It was a mundane task, but doing it together made it feel sacred. They were a team. In a world that was constantly trying to pull them in a million different directions, they had created a small, sacred circle of calm. When they finally went to bed, the house was quiet. He lay down beside her, watching the way the moonlight played across her face. She was already asleep, her breathing deep and rhythmic. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with his fingertip. She didn't stir. He thought about the man he used to be, the lonely figure riding through the empty streets, the man who thought he was destined to be alone. That man felt like a stranger now. He hadn't disappeared. The scars were still there, and the memories were still part of him, but they didn't control him anymore. He realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about weaving the past into a new story, a story where pain existed but was overshadowed by love. He had found someone who didn't want to change him, who didn't want to fix him. She just wanted to walk beside him. He closed his eyes and let out a long, contented sigh. The silence of the room wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was full of trust, full of safety, and full of the quiet, enduring power of a love that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. He drifted off to sleep, not as a solitary wanderer, but as a man who had finally found his way home. The architecture of their life together was strong, built on a foundation of daily kindness and the courage to simply be there. And for the first time in forever, tomorrow didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to look forward to. The years began to move with gentle, flowing rhythm, like a river that had finally found its way to the sea. The frantic, rushing energy of the past, the late nights, the constant movement, the feeling that he had to be somewhere else, had completely dissolved. In its place was a deep, abiding sense of presence. Keanu woke up one morning and realized that the heavy coat he had worn for so long, the one made of grief and resilience, was no longer necessary. He didn't need it anymore. He could hang it up in the closet and leave it there. It wasn't that the sadness had vanished entirely. Grief is a funny thing like that. It doesn't leave, it just changes shape. It becomes smaller, quieter, taking up less room in the heart. He had learned to carry it not as a burden, but as a memory of love that had existed. And now, standing next to him, was a love that existed right here, in the flesh, breathing and real. They were walking down a busy street in the city, the sun bright overhead. It was a crisp afternoon, the kind that nips at your nose but feels refreshing in your lungs. He held her hand, their fingers laced together in a grip that was firm and familiar. They didn't walk with a hurried, purposeful stride of people late for a meeting. They strolled. They looked in shop windows. They stopped when he saw a dog that looked like a bear, and they both laughed as it tried to drag its owner toward a tree. People passed them by. Some recognized him, doing a double take, their eyes widening. A few pulled out their phones to snap a picture from a distance. In the past, he might have tensed up, pulling his cap down lower or quickening his pace. But today he didn't flinch. He just squeezed her hand a little tighter and kept walking. He didn't feel the need to hide. If they saw him, they saw him. And more importantly, they saw them. He was proud to be seen by her side. They stopped at a small street vendor to buy hot pretzels. It was a simple, messy snack, salt and dough and warmth. They leaned against a brick wall, watching the traffic light change from red to green over and over again. He took a bite of his pretzel and looked at her. The sun was catching the silver in her hair, turning it into a halo of light. There were lines around her eyes now, deeper than when they first met. They were laugh lines, evidence of a life lived fully and joyously. "You know," he said, wiping a crumb from the corner of his mouth, "I used to think getting older was scary. I thought it was just things breaking down and slowing down." She looked at him, chewing thoughtfully. "And now I think it's a privilege," he said simply. "Not everyone gets to grow old. And getting to grow old with you? That's the best thing I could have asked for." She smiled, that warm, honest smile that still made his heart skip a beat. She reached up and brushed a stray hair out his face. Her hand was warm and rough from working the garden, grounding him in the moment. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" "We're more than okay," he replied. "We're real." He thought about the concept of home and how his definition of it had shifted. For years, home was a hotel room or a house that was too big for one person. Then, home became a feeling of safety he found when he was with her. It didn't matter if they were in a fancy suite or on a lumpy mattress in a rented cabin. As long as she was there, unpacking her books and making coffee. He was home. The walls didn't make the home. The person did. As they continued their walk, they passed a park where children were playing. The sound of laughter floated through the air, a pure, unburdened sound. He watched them for a moment, remembering his own youth, the rush of it all. He felt a pang of nostalgia, but it was sweet, not bitter. He had run his race. He had fought his battles. He had loved deeply and lost painfully. And now, he had found a peace that he didn't know existed. They decided to sit on a bench near a fountain. The water bubbled up, cascading over stones in a soothing pattern. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat there for a long time, watching the world go by. A businessman rushed past, yelling into a phone. A couple argued quietly about which direction to go. Life was happening all around them, chaotic and loud. But inside their little circle, there was calm. He thought about the arc of his life story. If it were a movie, this wouldn't be the climax. There would be no explosions or car chases. This would be the quiet epilogue, the part where the screen fades to black on a happy note. It was the part that usually gets cut because it's not exciting enough. But to him, this was the most important part. This was a reward. I was thinking about what you said a long time ago, he said softly, breaking the silence. What did I say? That grief is love with nowhere to go. I think I finally understand the rest of it. She tilted her head to look at him, which is that love doesn't disappear. It just finds a new place to live. And for me, it lives in the now. It lives in this, in us. He realized that healing wasn't a destination you arrived at. You didn't just wake up one day and say, I am healed. It was a continuous process. It was waking up every day and choosing to be happy. It was choosing to let go of the what-ifs and embrace the what-is. And with her, choosing was easy. She made the heavy things light and the scary things safe. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. The air grew a bit cooler. He stood up and pulled her up with him. Ready to head back? Whenever you are, she said. They started the walk back to their place. The streetlights were flickering on, one by one. The city was transitioning from day to night, the energy shifting from work to rest. He liked this time of day, the magic hour. It felt like a pause between breaths. He looked at her walking beside him, her stride matching his perfectly. They were a team. They were partners in the truest sense of the word. They had seen each other at their best and at their worst. They had seen the messy mornings and the tearful nights. And through it all, they had stayed. They hadn't run away. That, he knew, was a definition of real love. It wasn't a spark at the beginning. It was a fire that kept burning when the wind blew cold. As they approached their building, he stopped. He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. The streetlights illuminated her face, soft and kind. He looked into her eyes and saw his future. He saw years of walks and coffees and quiet evenings. He saw wrinkles that would deepen and hair that would turn whiter. And he saw himself happy to be there for all of it. Thank you, he said. For what? For being my friend, for being my partner, for showing me that it's okay to be happy. She squeezed his hands, her eyes shining slightly in the dim light. You make it very easy to be happy, Keanu. They walked into the building, greeting the security guard with a nod. They stepped into the elevator, and as the door slid shut, sealing them in their private world, he let out a deep breath. The day was done, but the story wasn't over. Far from it. This was just another chapter in a long, beautiful book that they were writing together, one page at a time. He wasn't a lonely figure in the dark anymore. He wasn't the action hero saving the world. He was just a man, holding the hand of the woman he loved, walking into the warmth of their home. The shadows of the past were long gone, faded by the bright light of the life they had built. He was whole. He was home. And as the elevator rose, carrying them toward their peace, he knew that the best was yet to come.